I am here at the quiet, lovely Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. The unique circumstances that led to President Taylor being laid to rest here in Louisville, Kentucky changed the course of American history and no doubt hastened the coming of the Civil War. In the 1840s, America was in an expansionist mood, what was called at the time America's manifest destiny. The idea that the United States of America was destined by history and by God to dominate the entire North American continent. The problem is that much of that continent was controlled by other folks, in particular Mexico. The grand prize the United States wanted more than anything else, the prize that President James K. Polk wanted, was California. President Polk offered to buy California from the Mexicans, and they refused. So what did President Polk do? He sent troops into a disputed territory and provoked a war with the Mexicans. The Mexican-American War, as it came to be known, would be a one-sided affair in which the United States of America dominated its southern neighbor and ultimately wound up taking about a third of its territory. One of the generals in that war was Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor, known as Old Rough and Ready, became a war hero, most notably for his exploits at the Battle of Buena Vista. Even before the war was over, a proposal was put forth in Congress that came to be known as the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso argued that any land taken from Mexico ought to be prohibited from having slavery in that territory. This was an idea that was endorsed by the overwhelming majority of members of the House of Representatives from the North and opposed universally by the South. What this illustrated was that the two sides of this country, North and South, free and slave, had very different ideas about what the future Western states should look like. The war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had ceded a massive tract of land to the United States of America, land that now comprises modern-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado. How the United States would settle that land, in whose image it would be made, the North or the South, would hasten the coming of the Civil War. 1848 wasn't just the end of the war. 1848 also happened to be a presidential election year. There were two main parties at the time, the Democratic Party, primarily from the South, and the Whig Party, primarily from the North. The Whig Party didn't have a candidate, and they reasoned, accurately, that they needed someone with broad appeal. Zachary Taylor had become a national hero for his success in that war. Taylor was a unique choice to run for president of the United States. After all, he was a pretty apolitical guy. Taylor had not had strong political feelings. In fact, he hadn't even voted in previous elections. So to get someone like him to run for president might seem surprising, but after all, this was a war hero. And the only other time the Whig Party had ever gotten anyone elected president was when they had run a war hero in the past, back in 1840, with General William Henry Harrison. You may recall that President Harrison had a very short presidency, only about 30 days. The Whigs had finally gotten someone elected president, and he died early in his term. That's unlikely to happen again, right? However, he agreed to be the Whig candidate, and in 1848, he successfully defeated the Democrats and the new Free Soil Party to ascend to the White House. Most assumed that Taylor would be a rather inactive president. After all, he didn't seem to believe the president had a lot of power. It was up to Congress to legislate. It was up to the president to enforce the law and not play a major role in that. He didn't seem to want to veto anything. He didn't want to seem to promote any ideas. He wanted Congress to legislate, and he wanted to steer the ship of state. Unfortunately for Mr. Taylor, the Mexican Cession, won in the Mexican-American War, in which he played such a major role, would be the defining issue of his short time in the White House. Just shortly after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had been signed and the United States of America had taken possession of California, something incredible happened. Near a place called Sutter's Mill, gold was discovered in 1848. And rumors spread that gold was everywhere in California. Thousands and thousands and thousands of gold seekers, 49ers as they came to be known, traveled to California in 1849, not just from America, but from around the world, hoping to find it rich. In fact, so many 49ers showed up in California that you can still see several dozen of them hard at work every Sunday afternoon in the fall. California was overrun with people. Very few of them actually striking it rich. Very few found gold. The majority found misery. California became a land of saloons and crime, and simply a place that was in desperate need of law and order. So the people of California got together, had a convention, wrote a constitution, and sent it off to Congress, hoping to be admitted as a state. They were bypassing the territorial stage. Interestingly, though, when the Constitution arrived in Congress in order to create California as a state, that Constitution they had written banned slavery. This was welcomed by Northern members of the United States Congress, and it was despised by those from the South. The South was insistent they were not going to allow California to join the Union as a free state. The reason was simple. Northern states, which had a greater population, already controlled the House of Representatives. But in the Senate, there had been a delicate balance, evenly split between free states and slave states. If California joined as a free state, that would upset that balance, giving the northern states permanent control of both houses of Congress. This was unacceptable to the South because they believed slavery, their peculiar institution, was under attack. Why did Southerners feel that slavery was under attack? Well, for one thing, the growing abolitionist movement was speaking out against the institution of slavery. And each year, hundreds and hundreds of enslaved individuals were finding their way to freedom via the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses led by conductors like Harriet Tubman, who made sure the people from the South took the arduous journey north, ultimately to Canada or northern states, in order to find freedom. What's more, those northern states were not returning these fugitive slaves, many having passed what were called personal liberty laws, arguing that if you were a runaway slave and you made it to freedom, in freedom you would stay. And the state would not cooperate in sending you back into bondage. Southerners also pointed to the movement by northern states to abolish the institution of slavery from Washington, D.C. And in the West, the recently added state of Texas was being aggressive, claiming territory in what is now New Mexico, wanting to expand their borders and with it, the institution of slavery. If California were to be added as a free state, it would have to include compromises for the South to protect their peculiar institution. But in a surprise move to all, President Taylor, the man who said he would not be active, the man who suggested he wouldn't veto anything, a Southerner by birth and a slaveholder, stood in the way, arguing that California should be a free state, they should be admitted, there shouldn't be any compromise at all. He wasn't interested in giving in to the South in order to allow California to join as a free state. And as for those folks in Texas that were threatening territory in New Mexico, he had no taste for that either. So we were at a deadlock. California wanted to be added to the United States as a free state. Southerners felt that slavery was under attack and wouldn't give in to any admission of California without significant compromise. Henry Clay from here in Kentucky, the great compromiser, rose to try to come up with a compromise one more time, allowing California to join, but then giving in to some of the Southern demands. The bundle of bills that came to be known as the Compromise of 1850 languished in Congress. And even if they had passed, again, it was unclear whether or not the president would even sign it because he suggested California should just be added, and that would be it. President Taylor, a Southerner by birth, a slaveholder, was making Southerners very upset. In July of 1850, on a very hot day, not unlike this hot day that we're experiencing right here, President Taylor went out to a ceremony for the new Washington Monument that was going to be constructed. On that hot day, he did what any of us would do. He tried to cool himself down, and he did it with a big iced pitcher of milk and copious amounts of fruit. He sat in the sun, he drank the milk, he ate the fruit, and by the time he got back to the White House that evening, he wasn't feeling too well. Over the course of the next several days, President Taylor became more and more ill. He became sick with gastrointestinal problems, and a few days later, the president died. President Taylor's death was sudden and it was shocking, but it also changed the course of American history. With President Taylor, who had opposed this compromise out of the picture, his vice president, the often forgotten Millard Fillmore, ascended to the presidency. Fillmore was more than willing to sign compromises that came out of Congress. And over the course of the next several months, that's exactly what happened. At the end of 1850, a bundle of bills that came to be known as the Compromise of 1850 was signed, giving concessions to both the North and the South. Concessions that would have long-lasting effects. So what did the Compromise of 1850 do? Well, it had several key provisions. First and foremost, California was added to the Union as a free state, giving the North control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, permanent control of Congress. This was no doubt a victory for the North. Second, though slavery was not outlawed in Washington, D.C., the slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings, was in fact outlawed in the nation's capital. Again, a victory for the North. Out west, the border dispute between Texas and New Mexico was settled. Texas would not take the land of New Mexico, instead would get a payment. New Mexico and the new territory of Utah would be organized, and the issue of slavery would be determined by what was called popular sovereignty, meaning that the people who ultimately would move to that territory would decide the fate of slavery in that territory for themselves. Because of the climate and the topography of those areas, it was unlikely that slavery would ever take hold in either New Mexico or Utah when they became states. Again, probably a victory for the North. So if the North was undoubtedly the winner in the Compromise of 1850, the one concession to the South was pretty infamous. Remember, Southerners were upset that runaway slaves were escaping to the North and they were being protected in the North. Southerners insisted on a new fugitive slave law, a law that would allow slave catchers from the South, with support of the federal government, to go into northern cities, to go into northern states, and arrest people, round them up, and sell them into slavery. With slave catchers from the South coming into Boston and New York, into northern cities and states, and rounding up people, many of whom had never been enslaved, were born free, but being sold into slavery, back into bondage. This aroused strong anti-slavery feeling in the North. The reality of Southern slavery was thrust into northern cities, and many Northerners, for the first time, as they saw people chained and taken away, began to fully understand what slavery was all about. And it began to strengthen the abolitionist movement in the North. So that's what the Compromise of 1850 did. It added California as a free state, giving the North control of both houses of Congress. It organized Utah and New Mexico into territories and left the issue of slavery up to popular sovereignty. It ended the dispute between the border of Texas and New Mexico. It kept slavery intact in Washington, D.C., but it outlawed the slave trade. And it created the infamous Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. All of these, in big ways and small ways, would lead to the division of the United States of America over the course of the next decade. But why am I at a cemetery? Why am I here next to the grave of Zachary Taylor? Remember, President Taylor was standing in the way of any compromise being signed. And shortly after he passed away, rumors began to start. Was this a natural death? Or had Southerners, frustrated with his opposition to compromise, had they taken matters into their own hands? Was President Taylor assassinated? Had he been poisoned? Rumors persisted for decades and decades and decades and decades, and there was no definitive proof. But conspiracy theorists wanted to know, had Southern radicals taken the life of the president in order to get this compromise through that ultimately would create the Fugitive Slave Act? So was the president poisoned? Was the president assassinated? The answer would not come until the early 1990s, when historians convinced descendants of President Taylor to allow his body to be exhumed from this grave in Louisville, Kentucky. A series of tests were conducted on the remains of the former president, and the medical examiner was able to determine definitively the president was not poisoned. It was probably waterborne illness, no doubt contributed by drinking all that milk and eating all of that fruit on that hot July day. The president got sick and he died. But his death opened the door for a vice president, Millard Fillmore, to sign a series of compromises that President Taylor himself would not sign, that no doubt hastened the coming of the Civil War.